Why do so many grown adults become offended when movie critics critique children's movies when really they just want kids to have better movies? It's part of a critic's job to watch dozens to hundreds of movies a year, to speak on the qualities that speak to the reviewer, and in many ways, the job of a critic is to provide an informed and articulate opinion that is always biased to one's taste, but does not ultimately exist to make you become an edgelord defending your favorite $500 million plus grossing movie, but to point out that children's media deserves criticism because children, simply put, deserve better movies. They deserve to be treated with dignity and respect and not given slop filled with a bunch of bright colors that's meant to emulate their experience being on YouTube Shorts or TikTok because that's all they know. And when talking to either parents of these young children or in cinephile circles where people are noticing the trends happening with kids' movies in the modern day, they feel like there's far less of them than ever before, and maybe some of these movies are getting dumped off into streaming because the second you have multiple children, a date the movies becomes quite expensive, and then studios respond by putting movies on streamers quicker or just on streamers, and then all of a sudden most of these movies feel like they don't exist because there's no object permanence. There's suddenly no urgency to watch these movies. They're seen as disposable and quickly forgotten or never found. But regardless of that distinction, how much has actually changed about children's films in the last 30 years? In some ways, we can make some observations about how these movies are made or how they exist. Many of the notable ones I'm talking about today are all video game adaptations, a subgenre of film that has been historically poor just time and time again, but people are only weirdly protective of these movies now, and a very different kind of children's movie. But I also think about the live action remakes of existing children's films, animated films, to rehash an older idea or sell more toys, or in the case of the How to Train Your Dragon remake, remind people of the property so that they can go to a theme park and experience that property in person as well, because in many cases there is more money in theme parks than movies, and doesn't that make Martin Scorsese more right about Marvel movies being theme parks than people give credit? And to make this all abundantly clear, I don't care if you enjoy a movie, I don't care if your kid enjoys a movie, it's good if your kid or you enjoy the Lilo and Stitch remake, or Super Mario Galaxy, or Five Nights at Freddy's, or the Minecraft movie, which I personally surprisingly didn't find as bad as some people imagined, and all this is good for you. I'm always glad when someone enjoys a movie that I do not. The goal of a critic is not to change your mind, it's again to articulate a well thought out bit of analysis and critique that doesn't have to align with your own. But can't we all look at the world around us and pay attention to the movies that are being specifically marketed towards children and wonder what exactly is happening to the landscape of children's media and specifically film, and don't kids deserve more regardless? My name is James, this is Movie Good or Movie Bad, and it has become increasingly impossible for me to talk about any sort of children's film regardless of which one it is, without 40-year-olds breathing down the back of my neck because they're upset that I had some form of critique, even though I might have actually liked the movie. And this especially becomes an issue because there is a growing audience of young kids who are watching these movies that are meant to just hyperstimulate their brain, who are finding themselves just bored somehow, which speaks to these movies not being good. Young people are people who just don't have the words to express the very challenging emotions that they experience, because just because a kid isn't saying something doesn't mean that they aren't feeling it, and movies are a bright and beautiful way for them to explore those challenging feelings, to explore new worlds, to find a new bit of hope as they're trying to unpack something they don't quite understand. So today in this video, we're actually going to break down what is a children's film, because there's not consensus on this, talk about where did all the kids movies go, how are they different from the past to now, actually breaking down some of the research about what is bad for children when it comes to the media that they're consuming, and maybe most importantly, giving you just a handful of recommendations to say, hey, here's some good movies for your kids to watch. I know it's early in the video, but if you do enjoy this, please like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell. It really does help a page like this, especially because my other platforms are a bit bigger. Speaking of which, if you do want to follow me in other places, I do have a letterbox where I've been reviewing movies for I think almost 7 years now, which is kind of wild to me. I also have a TikTok and an Instagram where I'm currently covering a series of 350 movies I wish more people talked about on social media, where there's a brand new movie recommendation every single day. And recently I covered Leaving DC, an indie horror film from 2013, following a man jaded with city living, moving to West Virginia into the wilderness, and when sending videos to his OCD support group, he starts wondering if something else is in the woods with him, which is just a really fantastic lo-fi and liminal horror film that if you really enjoyed the recent Undertone, you may really dig, as well as Platform, the 2000 film from Chinese director Zhe Zhongke, navigating the reflection of time as it slips through your hands from the perspective of 4 theater troupe members, which affected me to such an extent it is now in my top 10 movies of all time. Regardless, thank you all for being here, and just as a heads up, some of the movies we're talking about today were produced in conjunction with studios that are a little bit trigger happy on copyright. I'm gonna get a little bit creative when it comes to the edit here, as I always do, so just as a warning ahead of time. It's Nintendo. I'm talking about Nintendo. They already almost took out my TikTok account. we're talking about Nintendo here. And actually, to start off this video, I do want to talk about a distinction that becomes quite the bit more complex as I think about it, and that is, what exactly is a children's film? Whenever you hear the phrase children's film or family film, you have movies that instantly come to mind. At the same time, I do want to point out this is an expansive medium that actually doesn't define content or genre, rather than the appropriateness of content for a group of young children, with typically the best of these films having universal appeal and sometimes being attractive to older children, to adults. And some people do clearly prefer the term family films to grasp at that appeal, and if you have strong feelings, share that down below. But there's always been discussion and criticism about defining further what makes a children's film. In a group of rational people, whether cinephiles or not, most people likely believe that The Wizard of Oz or The Lion King or Shrek could be defined as children's media without batting an eye, but some cultural critics, such as Ian Wojcik Andrews, believes that any film that focuses on a child is a children's film, meaning that The Sixth Sense, the ghost thriller of the 90s, Pan's Labyrinth, the 2000s magic realist horror film Beast of the Southern Wild, the 2010s Hurricane Katrina drama, and Pejote, the 1980s Brazilian crime film, are all movies for children, which 9 out of 10 adults would take issue with. And yeah, I genuinely would too. I think that while all these films tackle the experiences of children and may have real-life analogs to the experiences of children in your lives, it doesn't necessarily make their content appropriate for children. While at the same time, the Studio Ghibli film Grave of the Fireflies, known for its devastating ending as a war film, does qualify for me as a children's film, and I can also rightfully say it was marketed as one. In Japan, during its initial theatrical release, it was billed as a double feature with My Neighbor Totoro, and while I do not have absolute verification, I've heard that some of the theaters that played both of these movies actually had Fireflies playing shockingly first. And while another film that tackles accidental matricide when living in an abusive home, the French animated film My Life as a Courgette, or My Life as a Zucchini in some parts of the world, penned by Celine Sciamma, director and writer of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, also is technically a children's film or family movie. Now, would I show either this or Grave of the Fireflies to an unsupervised 6-year-old? No, but I would show them to an older child with an adult presence in the room so that there would be a space to have conversation and speak on what emotions are coming up when watching the movie. And none of this even considers the fact that if you did find a film to be inappropriate for a child or believe it should not be seen by a child, it can still be seen by a child. Now, this doesn't mean that these movies are children's movies at all, but I remember times growing up and seeing Seed of Chucky was in movie theaters and recognizing parents were bringing kids younger than me to see those movies. I personally think a lot of those kids thought this character was Chucky from Rugrats, and that could have caused a lot of harm. Maybe not, but probably did. I remember going to see Deadpool in college and saw a number of parents brought kids between 5 to 9 years old to see the film, either because it was a brand new Marvel movie and their kids had seen R-rated movies at home, or they did not care to get a babysitter. And when I was a kid, I remember my first R-rated movie being The Terminator on a copy I found on YouTube that just edited out Arnold's butt, but kept in all the violence. I was also absolutely exposed to The Silence of the Lambs at a young age, and I've talked about this quite a bit, but my perception of cinema was changed as a 10-year-old with a laptop and the ability to pirate The Godfather. And while the consideration around R-rated films for children is far different depending on the household and the specific film and its adult content, what about a PG-13 film? I remember my parents letting me watch Jurassic Park pretty casually as a child. Sure, it did make me afraid of dinosaurs and that they were real and they were going to get into my house in the middle of the night, but it also made me curious about the process of filmmaking and how you make movies. When you look at any of the statistics from the MPAA or the Motion Picture Association of America, they do describe PG-13 movies as being children's movies because R-rated movies are for adults only. I can imagine that there are children out there who can handle Temple of Doom and Gremlins at a young age, and these were also the two movies that were so foundational to the creation of the PG-13 rating in America. And this evidence is anecdotal at best, but I remember it being a really big deal that Revenge of the Sith was coming to movie theaters as a PG-13 movie. I remember also going out to go to see the Simpsons movie and it was PG-13. Same thing with the Harry Potter movies, but none of this even factors in maybe with even some R-rated films like the Final Destination movies or any of your standard horror fare. It's probably appropriate for teenagers, and we can argue that they're the target audience. So maybe for some, those are actually children's movies. And really for today, despite having the PG-13 ratings that they do because of violent content, these superhero movies of today are really the most popular form of children's film, regardless of their appeal to adults, because they also exist to sell toys and comic books for children, and that is the goal of most large-scale children's films for the entirety of history, including, and and I learned this when I was reading Noel Brown's The Children's Film Genre and Narrative back in the 1930s when Disney had already started merchandising the few properties that they had. So whenever people think about naming as a critique that a movie exists as an advertisement for a toy, like with the Barbie movie, well, kids' movies have always been like that. But the real issue to me is that if these movies exist for any other purpose other than just to sell toys. And to circle back to what is a children's film, I really do like Noel Brown's 5 criteria for a children's film. And while not needing to be emphasized equally or to the T, one is to reaffirm family, kinship, or community, which, hey, you know, Watership Down does this too. So that is indeed a children's film, despite how upsetting it really is. 2, the foregrounding of a child, adolescent, or teenage figure, or even an innocent figure that reflects these qualities, such as a Pee Wee Herman. 3, movies will often demonstrate socialization and law and order, with people or groups who are disruptive to this being made a target for change in some shape or form, aka think about Clayton having that tumble at the end of Tarzan and becoming the target of his just desserts. 4, the broad minimization of adult content. Most violence or sexual content that takes place is replaced by suggestion or innuendo or addressed minimally within the context of the film. And 5, there is usually a happy ending of sorts, a bit of a criteria that I don't think is absolutely necessary, but I also see and understand why most children's media has a happy ending. And I'm mostly happy with the criteria here, and while we can still debate what age a child can see a film, if a film meant for an older audience is being marketed towards children, or what even is a good children's movie, we have a solid basis here for the idea that children's films push ideals and morals that are important for children, often focus on similar aged peers, avoiding much adult content, and sometimes challenging the ideals or beliefs around what a child might think. We've gotten that all the way, we have an operational definition, but now I have to say, where are all the children's movies? And forgive me, for this next segment and the rest of the video, I'm actually going to be referring to some of the movies that were made in 1999, or released in 1999, and compare them to the present because 1, these are some of the movies that were coming out when I was a few years old, and 2, it provides a stark difference to the quality of what is coming out now. Now, let's directly just list what was released in 1999 compared to 2026, and just note, human error could have caused a few films to be missed here or there. I just went off American release titles, otherwise this list would be way too long, and we could have more films released in 2026 for children. It's just still early, and you know, the final release list for the year is still being finalized, and because it is so early and some of these kids are so young, we really don't know what movies are going to stick with them over time. People's relationship to movies has just changed so much. Physical media is less of a presence in a household. A movie that I and critics might not like might be critically reassessed 10, 20 years from now, and kids will say it's a classic, and they can have that. So starting in 1999, we had movies like My Favorite Martian, Baby Geniuses, Dog's First Movie, The Phantom Menace, which yes, it is a children's film, The Brave Little Toaster to the Rescue, Tarzan, Muppets from Space, Inspector Gadget the live-action movie, The Iron Giant, Alvin and Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein, The Adventures of Elmo in Grouchland, Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, The Nuttiest Nutcracker. I thought Harold Ramis directed this. I misread this. I don't know what this is. Mickey's Once Upon a Christmas, Pokemon the movie, Toy Story 2, and somehow all on the same day on December 17th, 1999, we have Fantasia 2000, Stuart Little, and on direct-to-video, we have Wacko's Wish, the Animaniacs movie. Again, I could have easily missed a few obvious titles due to human error, and if you know any, please comment down below, or if there are any notable non-American films that stick out that were children's movies. Again, even if that popularity was in one part of the world, whether by country or region, please share those down below too. I really do want to see some of those movies. And when it comes to 2026, the kids' movies that stuck out to me on a cursory glance were Goat, which I believe was the first children's film of 2026 to get a release this past February, and just want to name that one of my online friends, Nick, has a story credit on the film. So if you or your kids enjoyed that movie, follow Nick on social media. We also have the Anderson .Paak movie, K-Pops, the Pixar movie, Hoppers, which was sadly altered pretty heavily for its conservationist and environmentalist content during production, although still a great movie, the Pout Pout Fish, Super Mario Galaxy, Animal Farm, which truthfully I might be talking about very soon. It really just depends how quickly I get to it. We have Mandalorian and Grogu, which feels the most like a family film a Star Wars movie has ever seen during marketing. Paw Patrol the Dino movie, which finally comes out on August 14th, the same day as The End of Oak Street, a Ewan McGregor and Anne Hathaway dinosaur film in the same vein as maybe Jurassic Park but toned down, or classic Spielberg, which even if it's PG-13, I'm gonna probably assume this is a children's movie. Then we're finally getting Coyote vs. Acme, then the Filipino-American Forgotten Island, then Shaun the Sheep, The Beast of Mossy Bottom, then Wildwood, then The Cat in the Hat with Bill Hader, then Ebenezer, A Christmas Story, the Ty West and Johnny Depp Christmas Carol adaptation, which I'm going to assume is a children's film. Maybe it's a horror movie with these two working together. I'm not seeing it, so I don't really care. And then Avengers Doomsday, and then Angry Birds 3, and then Jumanji 3, which is secretly Jumanji 4, but then when I look at the Jumanji film series Wikipedia page, it is Jumanji 5 because they count Zathura, which, you know, whatever. Sure, Jumanji 5. So looking at the list of these children movies released in 1999 versus 2026, I'm going to make a statement that seems very contradictory to the entire heart of this video, certainly the way that it was when I first started drafting this video. And sure, I skipped a number of children's streaming titles because I think it's way too hard and convoluted to name all of them, considering how many streamers are out there and how little I think anybody who's an adult who's a critic might be familiar with these movies. But the truth of it all is that there's always been a decent number of children's films. I could look back at other years, maybe this is an unusually high year compared to some, but I would argue that there's still the same number of children's films. There's still good movies and bad movies, but the real change here is the scale and the form and how these movies are being presented to everybody. I mentioned this earlier, but we have these massive superhero blockbuster films that absolutely have the target audience of children, but to focus in on that, these are massive $150 million to $250 million movies, and we also exist at a time where there are either movies with budgets in the low millions or these massive blockbusters, and the mid-budget film just no longer exists. That was between $20 to $50 million, unless you're pumping them out through A24 in 2026. Seriously, I think they're the only people making mid-budget movies other than maybe some of the independent studios under the larger studios. And looking at a rough estimate from an inflation calculator, everything cost about 98.2% more than it did in 1999, so roughly twice the cost. That means when looking at The Phantom Menace, it cost about $225 million, which felt comparable to a blockbuster until I saw the budget for Rise of Skywalker costing $593 million according to some estimates, which actually came out 7 years ago, so taking into account inflation, cost about $766 million. But this is outrageous. These are again outliers in the situation, but again comparing cost, Muppets from Space would cost about $50 million today. The Iron Giant would cost about $100 million. Toy Story 2 would cost about $180 million. And again, these all seem like a high average until you realize that the Doug movie would have cost about $5 million, and there are a large number of titles I named here, while in their lexicon of children's movies that they remember were actually direct-to-video movies in 1999. And this right here actually speaks to the ways that consumer habits changing have really affected the ways that we talk about these films. With some estimates, the average person in the United States in 2025 is going to the movie theaters only a handful of times a year. If you have more than 2 children and live in a 2-person household, a trip to AMC all of a sudden costs, what, $60 to $80 without concessions, and you might just wait to see what's on Netflix or wait for that movie to come out on streaming just because of that cost. And when people are going to the movie theater, they're being very selective. They're going to these big event films that these kids just have to see in movie theaters, or their friends are talking about in the playground, or they want to go to these birthday parties for, and everything else you wait for on Disney+. It's why movies like the Mario movie or Minecraft or the live-action Moana movie are going to be billion-dollar movies or are already billion-dollar grossing movies, because there's a hungry market for children's films and parents are dumping off all their funds into a handful of movies on the market, and you just hope the rest get a second life on streaming. And this isn't to assign blame to anyone, this is just pointing out the fact that some of these movies are making a ridiculous amount of money, just completely blowing past any of the estimates that any analyst would have, and it's at the cost of other movies doing poor. Going back to the mention of direct-to-video movies, for younger viewers, it's hard to deny how definitive some of these titles were for children in the 90s and really the pre-streaming era. The absolute first of these movies for children through the direct-to-video market was Tiny Toons Adventures: How I Spent My Vacation in 1992, a film that, while fairly well received, stayed on the Billboard charts for the top 40 best-selling VHS tapes for 16 weeks, and convinced Warner Brothers that Tiny Toon Adventures should have some episodes absolutely released on VHS because there was a gold mine of cash, even if we don't have those definitive numbers about how many copies sold or what it made. But it's not really until 1994 when children's films really become popular in VHS with the release of Return to Jafar and Land Before Time 2: The Great Valley Adventure, both low-budget sequels to very successful theatrical films, and again, again, most of these numbers are pretty unknown across the board, but I actually do have some comparisons here when it comes to the original Aladdin. That movie cost about $28 million to make in 1990s money, before Return to Jafar was made for about $6 million, but sold over 7 million copies on VHS, giving you a strong idea of how profitable some of these titles were, but also providing such a strong alternative that throughout the time of the VHS, whether it be the trend of people purchasing films or renting them through their local video rental stores, they were believed to be a huge competition for children's films appearing in theaters at all. And as I say this and I read this, this is the same exact conversation we're having now about the state of children's media, except the economics of how people spend their money on entertainment are so wildly different now. An example of this given in an article that I found from the LA Times that spoke pretty candidly about a dynamic that we do not see at all in determining if a film is profitable or not, which is the home video market, just period. And sure, they still sell physical media, sure you can buy those like $20, $25 rentals. I don't think we have really great idea of what the economics of all this is, so I'm going to put that to the side for a second. And going back to the LA Times article, an example that was given was actually Alfonso Cuarón's A Little Princess, a movie that grossed only about $7.9 million at the domestic box office. It did flop, but then sold 2 million copies on VHS, grossing about an additional $32 million, with 75% going to the studios, suddenly making a film that lost several million dollars that was a bomb very profitable. But even if a family was saving money purchasing a handful of VHS tapes or renting movies instead of going to the movie theater, they'd be engaging in a financial transaction that helps understand how successful a film is financially, which sounds very odd to say. Say a family in the 90s goes to the movies 3 to 4 times a year at $8 a ticket, buys 20 VHS tapes for about $15 a piece, whether it's Balto or Homeward Bound or Beethoven or Air Bud, whatever other dog movies there are, and rents maybe 30 to 40 movies at $3 a piece per movie throughout the year. This family of 4 is given a little over $540 to the film industry, but they're made a transaction for each one of these movies individually, whether it's buying them or renting or going to the movie theaters to see them. In the modern day, if a family of 4 goes to the movie theaters maybe twice a year at $15 a ticket and maybe spends $40 on streaming a month, maybe between Netflix and Disney Plus, then this family has spent about $600, which is arguably less spending power than the example that I named for 1999, and also doesn't factor in a distraction like a cell phone or second screen viewing experience, or how many films and what films these kids are exposed to. What is the content of these films, and what are kids taking away from these films? And maybe most importantly for this example, when I purchase a movie, whether it's on DVD or Blu-ray, or I buy a movie ticket or I rent a movie, I'm making it very clear I want to see this movie and support this movie financially. These metrics all of a sudden become far less clear on streaming when you're paying a flat price for a service that does not reflect how many movies you watch, or if you enjoy a movie, or would you have paid for a movie in the first place if it wasn't available somewhere else besides streaming. Unless you were pirating a film or catching it on TV in the 90s, which even then with that latter example we can point out, yeah, there's advertising dollars. You're watching this movie and saw this many ads. That is a metric there. And like also doesn't even factor in the prominence of the made-for-TV Disney Channel movie or comparable programming on other children's networks, and those were all treated as event movies. We all remember Luck of the Irish or High School Musical or Smart House or Twitches, and all these movies make money with advertising. There isn't really a similar financial system when you watch a movie on streaming, and there isn't a revenue trail that directly goes back to the streamer to say, I like this, give me more of this. You can turn on a movie and accidentally not be there. You can just be on a second screen the whole time and not pay attention. You can just keep rewinding back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and not be catching anything. And again, this doesn't factor in, would you give money for this, or is this just something that you're putting on to put something on? I mean, really consider this. How many movies have you seen with your kids on streaming, or have you seen on streaming that you would have paid for in a theater? Would you see The Electric State if it was released in theaters instead of streaming? Can you name any streaming movies that are there for your kids that aren't based on an existing property or TV show? The world that we live in is just so incomparable to the world of the past around film, and I'm not shaming any parents for relying on streaming or not going to the movie theater. It's a very expensive world out there. The movie theater used to be the art house of the everyday man, and now it feels like a luxury good in some regards, and that is a huge problem as well. And that doesn't even factor in the issue that when a lot of these corporate megaplexes with 8 to 24 screens are being dominated by these massive blockbusters, they fill up every single screen. There's show times all the time, and it leads to people becoming apathetic. They don't want to see these movies sometimes. Sometimes they want to check out what else is going on, and now they don't even bother checking because this is all that they're seeing. And now this much smaller children's film with less name or IP recognition gets forgotten, even when when it's far better received than the majority of popular children's films. Which, God, this doesn't even factor in movie deserts existing all across the United States. Occupy Cinema, which is a really fantastic social media page, recently shared a post naming about movie theaters not being in over half the counties in the United States. For those outside the United States, there are 3,000 plus counties. The fact that half of the counties in this country are losing out on the communal experience of the movie theater because you need to drive to a movie theater that's just over an hour each way is a sad progression and a cultural failing. It's hard to ignore how this also affects children and how they access movies and how they develop as adults. I've talked a lot already about how the concept of children's entertainment has changed over the last 30 or so years. I've talked about what is a children's film, where are we seeing these movies, where are these movies, and at the same time, you and I know, despite the confirmation bias that we have as old people yelling at the clouds at these young kids, something is different about these movies. The form of these movies is actually very, very different. And quite frankly, when it comes to the reason that any of these movies looks any different at all, it actually has to do with the device that I'm recording this very video on right now, a cell phone. There is no judgment at all coming with this observation at all, but how many people are watching this as part of a double screen experience? Who is doing their homework or catching up on some reading listening to my voice? Or maybe I'm really tiny on your phone while you're playing whatever mobile game is on your phone. And none of this is coming with any feedback. Consumer habits have just changed so much over time. The ways that we engage with any type of media are so different. And I've honestly gotten a lot of feedback that people are unable to multitask watching my videos because they're so dense, which is a wild response at some level. But bringing this back again to children's media, I say this time and time again, parents are busy. They're overworked. The American dollar's spending power is shrinking. They're barely able to get food on the dinner table, let alone think about the time to make dinner. And some parents have to have multiple jobs. Sometimes your side gig has to exist because you need more money. And then they put their kids of all ages on phones or iPads just trying to get a single break. And these kids are addicted. I'm by no means an expert on any of this, but when attempting to go any of the databases or existing research at a cursory glance, a lot of what's out there for studying children is not longitudinal, which means that we can only see changes over a brief period of time and not actually see how any of these shows or movies affect kids over time, which I get it. Childhood is a very delicate time. If you can make an intervention happen, it's important to do it now rather than like, oh, let's just see what happens if these kids watch all these snuff movies for 10 years and see how they do. No, that's completely unethical. But really, when looking at the data, two really big consistent pieces of data stuck out to me. One, kids need enriching, challenging content to develop and become more creative thinkers, to expand their problem solving, to be the best types of individuals that we engage with in our everyday. And two, any increased screen time leads to attention and behavior issues, which makes sense. You provide a kid with an electronic device unsupervised that works like a dopamine machine, then suddenly those receptors in their brains are going to go off, and it simulates what happens with people when they develop addiction issues, whether we're talking about what happens with substances or adult content or gambling. Toddlers who grow up this way become teens who grow up this way, who become adults who can't focus on a single thing in front of them because their attention span has constantly been so low. And when you have people like Matt Damon sharing that Netflix is telling people to make movies where plot points are regurgitated over and over again because no one's paying attention, and yes, even if Netflix denies it, I think there is some element of this that's being pushed by the industry because we're seeing all this. I'm not blind to it. And constantly when exploring this topic in children's media too, Cocomelon comes up, and when attempting to look up the research that's out there, while there are some social media doctors who push back on Cocomelon creating an issue for children's media, I came across dozens of threads with anecdotal evidence of parents presenting what was happening with their kids, and it felt like a lot of addiction symptoms were cropping up, like I described before, and there's a number of studies that I found even beyond that, including one called To Study the Effects of Cocomelon on Young Children's Behavior and Emotions, written by Dr. Nandita Tripathi Pragya and Dr. Yukti Sharma, forgive me for the mispronunciation, for the International Journal of Indian Psychology, where they explicitly declare the connection between Cocomelon and short attention spans, and none of that is surprising. So not only are we dealing with media shaped to fit people's shrinking attention spans with faster cuts or movies and TV repeating back plot threads to you, but there's also a full-blown change in the types of stories being shared. And we know this because the disgruntled animators speaking out, and just again, the trends that we're noticing when watching films. Most notably, when thinking about the changes ongoing with Pixar in the last 7 to 8 years, I would say, there were changes changes internally with the firing of John Lasseter when he was outed as the chief creative officer after sexual misconduct allegations, leading to Pete Docter, director of Monsters, Inc., Up and Inside Out, taking on this role. And through COVID, the vast majority of Pixar's films were being released on Disney+, including Luca and Turning Red, and the first Pixar film released in theaters post-lockdown was Lightyear, a film with a tepid reception and an even worse box office, further demoralizing staff and leading to reports of various wording through Pete Docter himself, leaks and rumors from frustrated current staff about Pixar films and television shows being altered in content to remove explicit mentions of diversity, which I can confirm. I have heard of these rumors and these allegations from people who've worked at Pixar before. This is happening. And former staff, including Sarah Ligotek, a former assistant editor at the studio who in December 2024 for The Hollywood Reporter spoke to an explicitly transgender character having a storyline significantly reduced in the television show Win or Lose, which we can confirm from leaks that have come out that I am not sharing due to copyright strike possibility. There is rough footage out there. We've also heard stories about how the environmentalist messages of Hopper became toned down, and while the film still has a conservationist message, who knows how much more explicit or clear it could have been, or if there's a much more specific condemnation of the then mayor in the film, or directly naming of climate change as an issue within the film. But I'd also argue while these issues around filtering content of film have always been present in the modern day, it's just happening more and more around identity. I name in the same breath as there's an issue with adults consuming only children's media, as that's saying while not all children's film tackles challenging material, we used to have movies like The Lion King that dealt with death, or Finding Nemo that dealt with a missing child, or Avatar: The Last Airbender, which explored genocide and being the lone survivor of your people. And that's not to say that these are the best movies exploring those topics. If you're an adult, you should be exploring further out there to explore these topics within film. And that's not to say that there aren't great films or movies being made for children that are challenging or have thoughtful reflection. But there is a flattening of this material, and not always the case. I do think there's a challenge sometimes where we do not have complicated protagonists and instead have complicated antagonists, leading to effectively very little conflict in a movie. I sometimes call this the Disneyfication of villains. We don't just see this in Disney animated films, but also Marvel films where you get these just quote-unquote complicated villains. There's suddenly no strong desire to have a villain be a being of evil. There's actually a complicated backstory that made them this way, and actually we have to be sympathetic towards them, which to me starts my mind, at least in this modern era with children's films with Maleficent, you suddenly have so much less conflict shaping your picture, making a picture where everybody can get along and you're devoid of any real conflict. And these characters have always existed, like I think about like Magneto for the X-Men, but why does Thanos need a sympathetic backstory? He's a bad guy. I even feel this way for the Wicked Witch of the West with Wicked or Loki in the MCU movies. I don't care for him at all to be a sympathetic character. And let me be clear, none of this is inherently bad on its own. I think about Kylo Ren throughout the entire sequel trilogy, and despite my issues with Rise of Skywalker, I think his character arc is amazing, but that doesn't speak to the trope. It speaks to good writing. It speaks to writing with purpose. It speaks to the entirety of conflict taking place within those three films. There is real conflict. There is great writing. And I think lots of bad children's films don't have those two things. But aside from my vague observation, where please, if you do know any more examples, share them down below, the biggest shift I'm starting to see with any of these movies, aside from how we view them, is actually the presence of these key video game movies that you saw in my thumbnail, the Five Nights at Freddy's movies, the Super Mario movies, and the Minecraft movie. And to the ire of many 30 to 40-year-olds, I and many of my contemporaries have accused these movies of rattling the keys of their audiences in order to gather attention. And since planning this video, we actually got some of this confirmation, at least for the Super Mario Galaxy movie, from Shigeru Miyamoto from Nintendo Dream, where he confirmed that the choice of the film being so fast-paced to be intentional. And some of this is from a machine translation. There could have been some issues translating Japanese to English. Miyamoto speaks on parents sitting in the movie theater out of responsibility for taking their children, and since so many children run around the movie theater they can't sit still, he wanted a movie where there's no time to catch your breath, so that way kids would have to sit down too. In genuinely watching the movie, there is no time to catch your breath, and while I'm not a plot enthusiast obsessed with narrative, and I'm fine with the movie taking its time, I found myself genuinely baffled at how much of the film moved at a breakneck speed with so little happening. It was an overstimulating nightmare that provided all sorts of references that made me think about these games that I and my dad grew up on, but none of it leads to anything substantial. None of it makes up for the fact that it's a poorly written movie. It's just meant to flood your brain with references and jingle the keys at you. Oh look, here's some Pikmin. Here's Rob, everybody. Here's the bony Bowser. Here's Fox McCloud. It's what's his name? Oh god, the guy, the Tom Cruise protege. God, what's his name? Glenpal, but I don't actually have much to say because there's so little of substance here with this movie. Providing all these references doesn't make a film of substance. It says a lot that it was impossible to look away from anything in the film, yet several points in the movie I'd asked my spouse Haley, had I missed something? Like, so much was happening on the screen in front of me, and yet I hadn't. It was this paradoxical situation of being bored while watching a film that completely overtook my senses. Shockingly though, while I had the same issue with the Minecraft movie after the first 20 minutes devolving into the same type of overwhelming visual callback, I at least found myself appreciating the art style of the animation, and at least there was some thought to the identity of the film with its comedy. I felt actually a bit of shame and shock, laughing as much as I did. The gag about Jason Momoa being that kid's uncle was genuinely very funny. In the case of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, while it has a unique issue in that I think it doesn't know how to manage its tone, being known as a terrifying video game filled with loud jump scares, instead focusing on retelling existing lore to fans and not knowing how to handle even the slightest of scares, those lore dumps are also about repeating back to the audience what they already know. Those are those same references. They add little as an adaptation. It's just about pointing and oohing and ahhing at something you already know, rather than telling a narrative that you may be familiar with in a way that grips you, just better suited for film. It's wild that all three of these movies are video game movie adaptations that were received poorly, have developed incredibly defensive fan bases despite grossing such a high dollar amount, are guilty of this one issue around key jingling, and all these movies have been perceived as boring by some, including young children, and maybe a Minecraft movie is the least guilty of it. And like I said before, there's always good movies and bad movies for children, but what's the big issue here is two really awful movies that have tons of issues made over $1 billion. And what I'm concerned with is in the future, studio executives will see this, realize they don't need to have a good script at all because they believe that children aren't worthy of a good film, and when they see these box office numbers, there's little care about making any meaningful improvement with a sequel. Just look at Super Mario Galaxy and Five Nights at Freddy's 2 to actually prove how some of these films can become considerably worse. Referential elements of a children's film don't have to be bad either. I think about any of the Muppets movies and moving up to even the present movies. Some of these movies may not feature the entire cast, but there might be a wink or a nod at another one of the Muppets or another Jim Henson creation, but the core of these movies is still wonder and curiosity, and maybe a challenging lesson along the way as we all exist as dreamers. Or I think about Who Framed Roger Rabbit and how the movie could easily be lost in its cameos and its blend of live action and animation being a gimmick, but instead we have thoughtful characterization and a tantalizing mystery that keeps most children gripped. Kids don't need bright flashing lights and colors and loud noises and references to keep attention. Just recently we had the animated film Flow, following a black cat and several other animals with no dialogue, lots of moments of slow stillness with ambient noise from nature sounds, and a story that allows for a lot of interpretation, and so much of this will not just grip your kids, but also your cats. My second oldest cat, Launch, and I do have 4 cats, watched 90% of this movie and was clearly reacting along the way watching it as well. It's pure magic in every way, and I really do have to recommend the film. And when bouncing off of this and thinking about some suggestions about children's media from the AAP or the American Academy of Pediatrics through the Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health, they broadly suggested movies and TV that could help your children develop language, either through singing along with songs and letting them fill in the gaps, or making hand gestures alongside said songs. Ask your children questions to see if they understand what's going along with inside the film and build their comprehension skills, and expand on their imagination by taking what was gained from the movie and applying it to the outside world. That means you can sing along with the Muppets during the original Muppet movie. You can ask your kids what do they think about the cat and their friends and what they're doing in Flow. Give them their first exposure to a Studio Ghibli movie and have them practice along to reading subtitles so they can develop that skill. Show them the 70s Indian film Kumati that follows a trickster god as he turns children into animals, and let your children bask in the beautiful music and a challenging folktale. If you have children who've lost a pet or may lose a pet, it may be helpful to show them the Czech film Even Mice Belong in Heaven, a film about a mouse and a fox who are mortal enemies who end up in animal heaven and become friends, and leads to a watch that is so moving and grounding at the same time. Watch the recently Oscar-nominated film Arco and witness a Studio Ghibli-inspired film about time travel, and then have some discussions about environmentalism afterwards. Watch Boys Go to Jupiter and see fun isometric designs and sing along to catchy songs as we follow a teenager in Florida trying to raise enough funds on a food delivery app so that he can leave the suburbs. If you have a kid who wants to get a few scares and is just getting introduced to horror, show them the 1990s film The Witches. My point in this very long and rambly video is that in the 30 years of children's films, there have always been good and bad kids movies, just the ways that we engage with them have changed, and the desire to only go to the theater for these big event films has weirdly translated to really poor children's films becoming some of the highest grossing of all time, and this is telling studio executives that your children are not worth the respect of a great script, and that is insulting. Kids deserve great movies. Show them these great movies, whether at home or in theaters, especially if they challenge who they are or help them be more imaginative. These movies are always out there. We just need to show them the way. The film industry and these major studios have conditioned us and audiences as a whole to accept a lower standard, and it's okay to push back against that. It's okay to see these films and recognize something is wrong here. I say all that as kids are screaming outside. They know something's wrong too, guys. It's okay to pick an alternative, less popular film choice and give that movie your money in theaters and give your kids a richer experience. In the last 30 years, we've had similar conversations about the state of consumer habits changing and less people going to the movie theaters, but we're seeing less creator-driven ideas, more films based around existing IP and what the studios want, and because of that, films are no longer educating your children, providing them with new experiences, letting them develop their imaginations, and further reinforcing your kids wanting faster and faster dopamine hits as films start to look like apps that we're scared of our children using. At the end of the day, make sure your children are enriched. Movies let your kids into new worlds where they can safely explore questions on themselves. It's important that we give them these opportunities, even if it feels like the major studio children's films are not letting your kids do so. I keep staring at all this information in front of me, and in so many ways, while I see plenty of good children's films, they're not the ones making the most money. And while I'm not scared at the data in front of me, I am concerned what lesson is learned from a Minecraft movie and these Mario movies being billion-dollar grossing movies, because once these studios realize you'll pay for movies that require little creative effort, that is all that they're going to give your kids. And the most terrifying future of all, especially where AI somehow horrifyingly could win, which I won't let that happen, but if it does, none of these movies will definitely be any good and nobody will be able to tell. This was an odd video in so many different ways that became so much more sprawling as I planned it out and wrote it out, but I do want to say, I think even though there's even more branching paths we could go down, I'm going to stop us here. I'm going to pause this. I hope you all did enjoy this video. If you liked it, like the video. If you disliked it, sure, dislike the video. Comment, share your thoughts about what may have been missing. What are some other talking points that you think are very relevant in modern children's medium? I hope you all enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, hit that bell, comment down below if you enjoyed this video, you feel like there's a missing thread that I didn't tackle, or in other parts of the world, what are you noticing with the children's films being released in your countries? If you're offended, it's okay to be offended. Please just comment down below. We can duke it out. And there might be another video coming up very, very soon. I do want to say there's a very big video planned for the channel at the final weekend of May. It might take the entirety of May for me to put this together. I'm not quite sure how long it's going to be. It could be much longer than this. There might be a mini video. It's a video that I don't think will be very long in content, but it requires a lot of viewing. So if I can get to it, I get to it. If not, that'll come later. I'm gonna go figure that out, but this was James. Thank you all for being here, and please do tune in again next time.